She spent years helping her husband build a successful life, but when their marriage collapsed, the anger and betrayal turned into one of the most infamous revenge killings in America. Betty and Dan Broderick met in college in the 1960s and eventually married, starting what seemed like a normal family life. In the early years, Betty worked constantly to support the family while Dan pursued his education. She took on odd jobs and handled nearly everything at home, raising their children, running the household, and helping keep the family afloat financially. While Dan attended medical school and later decided to switch careers and go to law school, Betty continued juggling work and caring for the kids. Eventually, Dan became a very successful medical malpractice attorney in San Diego. From the outside, the Brodericks looked like they had everything: money, success, and a large family. But behind the scenes, their marriage had already begun to deteriorate. Friends later said the two fought often, and tensions in the relationship continued to grow as Dan's career took off. Then in the early 1980s, Dan began a relationship with a much younger woman named Linda Kokina. Linda had originally worked as his legal assistant. When Betty discovered the affair, the marriage completely unraveled. The divorce quickly became extremely bitter. Betty felt she had sacrificed years of her life supporting Dan while he built his career only to be replaced. As Dan's relationship with Linda became more serious, Betty's anger escalated. At one point, Betty even broke into Dan's home and took Linda's wedding registry list, later destroying items connected to their upcoming wedding. There were also incidences where Betty entered the house and damaged property. Courts eventually ordered her to stay away from the home and return items she had taken. But the conflict continued to escalate. Dan and Linda eventually married, and the situation between Betty and her ex-husband became increasingly hostile, with arguments, harassment, and ongoing court battles over money and custody. Their children were often caught in the middle of the conflict. Early in the morning on November 5th, 1989, Betty drove to Dan's home in San Diego. Using a key she had taken from one of her daughters, she entered the house while Dan and Linda were asleep. Betty walked into their bedroom and fired several shots with a revolver. Dan and Linda were both killed in their bed. After the shooting, Betty turned herself in to police. Her trial soon became national news. Some people sympathized with her, believing she had been pushed to the breaking point after years of betrayal and a bitter divorce. Others believed the murders were a deliberate act of revenge. In 1991, Betty Broderick was convicted of 2 counts of second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 32 years to life in prison. Even decades later, the case continues to divide public opinion. Some still see Betty as a woman who snapped after years of emotional turmoil. Others believe jealousy and anger ultimately led to tragic and a calculated crime.